So without further ado, I'd like to introduce Vijay Prashad.
Okay, thank you. Please. Okay. So let me first I'd mentioned it earlier, but I'll tell you, the first time I came to the Breck Forum, it was quite a historical thing for me. I had come to New York City from, I guess at the time I was working in Rhode Island, and I had written an essay and sent it just like that to Monthly Review. And I'd never sent an essay to any of the American Marxist periodicals before. And I got a letter written, very elegant letter, handwritten, from Paul Sweezy. And he had said there's several problems. I think he found problems in a lot of this, several formulaic problems. He said, so I talked to him one day on the phone, and then he said, do you ever come to New York City? And I said, not really. He said, well, if you come, we can discuss the essay. So, of course, I took the bus to New York City. And I came to the Monthly Review office, and we were discussing the essay. And suddenly he said to me, let me show you something. And he got up, and I followed him across the hall. And he took me into the Breck Forum. And he gave me a tour and a history lesson of the Breck Forum. And it was my first introduction to the Breck Forum. And he was a great guy. He was a generous editor, brilliant man. And I wish that our generation had had more time with him. I know previous generation had had their moment with somebody like that, but we never got enough time. But then, of course, we used to use the Breck Forum for our school, our YSS school, and that was fun. And I'll always remember the drumming office. Remember the drummer? There was somebody who rented an office who had drumming. Olatunji. So in the middle of our meeting, suddenly drumming used to happen there. That space was good because it was a negotiation of all these Chinese solidarity movement, some Filipino organization, right? Then taxi worker came as well. But initially, I think the Chinese Solidarity Office was the one that was almost 24 hours open. I think the gentleman there was there all day. Otherwise, the others, so the Breck Forum. So the theme that you had suggested was from 9/11 to the Arab Spring. And of course, I have written something to read out, which I will do because I'll remember things then. But I thought I'll go back and go over some common familiar ground about 9/11. That may seem familiar, but hopefully it'll be like a reminder of some things that we have forgotten about 9/11 and the aftermath, etc. And the projects that emerged in 9/11, through 9/11, and the projects that, in a sense, hastened what you might consider the kind of crisis of American power that 9/11 produced. I will share a little of those ideas, but before that, of course, the problem with the idea of 9/11, and I'm going to read a little bit about that as well, is that it has become, in a sense, a myth. And when any historical event becomes a myth, it becomes impossible to ask questions of the myth. And so it almost is a conversation stopper than a conversation starter. And I'm going to introduce some of those things. Finally, I'll talk a little bit about the role of US-China relations, and I'm going to end on some themes that I was talking about at the seminar earlier, which is what I think our task now is to revitalize American culture in that sense that we have a cultural problem, which I think is important, that you cannot solve some political tasks unless you are able to transform the field of culture, which is blocked to most of us. Most of us cannot act politically because of a certain cultural blockage. So those are some of the themes I'm going to raise. So let me read this out. If it's starting to get boring, I'll stop and talk. We'll see. Okay? So I'll meet you at the other end of this. Okay. This is called 9/12. The United States is blessed by its remoteness. The last major war on its landmass was the Civil War. Over 500,000 people died, and the American land was scarred by the enormity of this first, what you might consider an industrial war. No such large-scale bloodletting took place within the territory after that apart from the wars against the Amerindians in the American West in the last few decades of the 19th century. Henceforth, the United States took its battles to other people's lands. Of course, the Philippines, Cuba, Puerto Rico, Central America, West Asia, the long war in Europe from 1914 to 1945, and the wars of the Pacific and Africa. The shock of the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor has to be understood in this context of remoteness. No wonder that President FDR called it a date which will live in infamy. No wonder, too, that when the aircraft struck the World Trade Center and the Pentagon, the immediate analogy was sought in Pearl Harbor. President Bush chose to give his 2001 memorial speech for the Japanese attack aboard the USS Enterprise. And he said, "The attack on Pearl Harbor was plotted in secret." He's saying this with one eye on 9/11. "Waged without mercy, taking the lives of 2,403 Americans. The same kind of attack on a quiet day, in his interpretation, occurred on September 11th, with a larger loss of life, but with no different resolve from the country." Then, at that time, in 1941, the US retaliated by going to war against Japan and Germany. And in 2001, it did so by going to war first against Afghanistan and then very soon after against Iraq. What is of interest from this speech of Bush is his characterization of the enemy. He says that terrorists are heirs to fascism. They have the same will to power, the same disdain for the individual, the same mad global ambitions. So just as the United States had to fight a global war against fascism in the Pacific, the Atlantic, the Mediterranean, and eventually in Europe, so too would the United States now have to fight on a global scale. Nothing else was possible. Not only did the United States have to fight on a massive territory, in other words, the planet, but also it would have to engage the enemy for an indefinite time. There was no spatial or temporal barriers to this battle. Then he says, like all fascists, the terrorists cannot be appeased. And the young sailors cheered at that point. They must be defeated. This struggle will not end in a truce or treaty. It will end in victory for the United States, our friends, and the cause of freedom. A country insulated from war on its territory has no stomach for destruction and loss of life on its soil. When the US was attacked at its embassies in Kenya and Tanzania in 1998, or in the harbor of Sana'a, Yemen in 2000, its response was no doubt swift and fierce. But in none of those cases was there such a massive emotional response in US society. There simply was not the cultural preparation to expect that violence of such a spectacular nature could enter the country. Africa, Eurasia, and Latin America, on the other hand, are relatively inured to massive attacks of this kind. From the grotesque massacres of Hiroshima and Nanking to Dresden and Srebrenica, from the Great Lakes of Africa to Darfur, for instance, these are the most notorious incidents or events of an extended trail of tears that runs from the recent past into the present. Violence from within and from outside is not unknown in the emotional armory of most of the world's peoples. Such violence seemed anachronistic in the United States, even though large numbers of people die each year from small gunfire and in automobile accidents. Death, of course, is not abolished, but war seemed to have been. 9/11 was a reminder that the physical remoteness of the United States had been overcome by technology. No longer was the United States landmass too distant from the fights it picks in the rest of the planet. So when President Bush declared his global war against terror, or what I like the phrase GWAT, global war against terror, it felt odd. The United States had already involved itself in combat with these same social forces that attacked it on 9/11. So the declaration of war was the odd thing. You're declaring a war that you've already been a part of. To make such a formal declaration of war allowed the administration to do at least two things. First, on the surface, to indicate that the 9/11 attacks came from nowhere. and therefore to make the claim that the United States was now going to enter a conflict for the first time. It allowed the United States to appear as an innocent bystander that now wanted justice for something it did not deserve. The second claim, slightly beneath the surface, was a bit more complicated. Very quickly after September 11th, the idea of 9/11 became a kind of myth. The notion that an involvement in the Arab lands and South Asia, that is Afghanistan, Pakistan, so Iraq, Afghanistan, Pakistan, through warfare toward the control of oil and political power, this became in a way annulled, because after all, 9/11 is going to excuse everything, as I'm going to just point out. None of that seemed relevant. This war for oil, political power, whatever the motivations were, none of it seemed relevant. If anyone suggested that this was the case, they were shunned. And many of you remember Professor Ward Churchill making the comment about the chickens come home to roost. Well, they really went after Ward. And it was not only after Ward, but the going after Ward had a chilling effect on many of our contemporaries who felt very scared, I think, to point out the roots of 9/11, to historicize 9/11. After all, just as, what is his name? Al Capone was taken down for tax evasion, they got Ward Churchill on alleged plagiarism charges. It was impossible to get him on his comment, but they went after him nonetheless, and this had a chilling effect. Okay. The idea of 9/11 as a myth as well provided cover for any future disasters, whether financial crises or wars to come. When CNN reporters covering Afghanistan would report on civilian casualties, the anchors were told, the anchors sitting in Atlanta, were told to put those civilian casualties in a broader context. CNN's chief at the time, Walter Isaacson, sent a memorandum to his anchors on October 2001 saying, and this is what he said, "As we get good reports from Taliban-controlled Afghanistan, we must redouble our efforts to make sure we do not seem to be simply reporting from their vantage or perspective. We must talk about how the Taliban are using civilian shields and how the Taliban have harbored terrorists responsible for killing close to 5,000 people." In other words, the United States audience has to always be reminded that if there are civilian casualties in Afghanistan, the civilian casualties are only happening because the Taliban are in fact responsible for their deaths. That it's 9/11 that authorizes the killing of civilians in Afghanistan. In other words, these small stories of civilian deaths should not tarnish the larger goal. Any atrocity should shrivel before the blinding light of 9/11. 5 hours after the aircraft struck the towers in the Pentagon, Defense Secretary Donald Rumsfeld met with his staff. The CIA had already ascertained that the likely perpetrator, based on intercepted phone calls, was Al-Qaeda. Nonetheless, the thinking in the Bush cabinet was much more capacious. Rumsfeld notes are very interesting, and they were written about at the time, but I think many of us have forgotten them. So Rumsfeld, his note paper said the following. He said, "Hit SH at same time, not only UBL," which is to say, hit Saddam Hussein or Iraq at the same time, not only Osama bin Laden or Afghanistan. He wanted his Pentagon lawyers to talk to Paul Wolfowitz, Rumsfeld's deputy, about a connection between Iraq and bin Laden. Then Rumsfeld wrote the famous words, "Go massive, sweep it up, things related and not." Okay, Rumsfeld is the master of a modern form of English. I mean, in a way, twittering is made for Rumsfeld. Because if you read any of his notations, they are like that. Go massive, sweep it all up, things related and not. In that is captured the Bush doctrine. For Rumsfeld and his neoconservative clique, 9/11 provided an incredible opportunity. During the Clinton years, the neoconservatives were out of power, thirsting to return. In exile, the foreign policy wing of the neoconservatives created the Project for a New American Century between 1997 and it pretty much closed down in 2006. In September 2000, they released a report called Rebuilding America's Defenses, a testosterone-laden argument for increasing military spending and using the massive US military power to capture political and physical resources around the world. The American century, or Pax Americana, was in threat of being undermined by global government, that is the United Nations and the newly formed World Trade Organization, and the emergence of new powers, namely China. To thwart the loss of power, in other words, the impending decline of empire, the project urged the government to build up a military, a huge military, and to construct a foreign policy to spread American values around the planet. Such change was going to be impossible in a climate, that is the 1990s, that seemed to privilege prosperity and peace. That seemed to. I mean, it's not like it was, but it seemed to. Therefore, the 2000 report noted the process of transformation, even if it brings revolutionary change, is likely to be a long one, absent some catastrophic and catalyzing event like a new Pearl Harbor. On September 11th, the Project for a New Century was provided with its new Pearl Harbor, an incredible opportunity for their agenda. Bush's spatial and temporal extension of the global war on terror derived its theory from the Project for a New American Century. In fact, he hired most of its leaders into his administration. There was to be no attempt at a police investigation and a global police action to secure the criminals. The point was now to use 9/11 for maximum effect, to hastily dispatch the Taliban in Afghanistan and then to rush into war with Iraq. Today, the United States is at war from the Atlas Mountains to the Hindu Kush, with its Navy and Air Force, its special forces and drones in action or poised to act. From these missions, the United States enlisted, or for these missions, the United States enlisted a willing NATO command, which had found its post-Cold War legs already in the Kosovo War of 1999. NATO would be thrust into the forefront in Afghanistan and later Libya, but it would also be the spear to irritate the Russian ambitions in Eastern Europe and in the Black Sea regions. Conservative estimates of the war dead in Afghanistan, Iraq, and Pakistan alone amount to close to 150,000, with the rough total of refugees caused by these wars now upwards of 7.8 million. That's the United Nations figure on the rough estimates of refugees from just these three theaters: Iraq, Afghanistan, and Pakistan. 7.8 million people made refugees. When I read that, that's a conservative, that's a UN estimate. It's remarkable. There is little indication that the United States and NATO plan to draw down their involvement in this region, even as they might reduce their own deployment of troops. That's the shell game that the Obama administration plays. The bases and the foreign policy objectives will stifle the ability of countries like Afghanistan and Iraq to develop their own societies, which means that Afghan and Iraqi security services will be pledged to conduct the security work that approximates the extension of American power. Much of this is already taking place in these two countries, where the continual social corrosion has taken on the character of a civil war, with the governments in both countries acting as proxies for US global ambitions. The Project for a New American Century did not fully think through its implications. It assumed that by military force itself, the United States would be able to extend its power into a new American century. What it did not consider, or it did not care for considering, were the massive social costs of this endeavor. Bush sent his troops into battle, but he could not find a sustainable way to conduct these wars. Anti-tax rhetoric is the analgesic of the domestic neoconservatives. Their agenda contradicted those of the foreign policy neoconservatives. The domestics could not countenance a rise in taxes to pay for the wars. In fact, they won the right to cut taxes. This meant that the United States had to borrow massively to fund the expansion of its military and its use of that military. Between September 11, 2001 and May 2011, the National Priorities Project shows that the United States Exchequer spent $7.6 trillion in defense and homeland securities. So in the last 10 years, the United States has spent $7.6 trillion. Trillion, not billion. Billion is what they lose accidentally. This is $7.6 trillion. That figure is bewildering, of course. The combination of this military spending, the Bush cuts in taxes for the wealthy, the bursting of the asset bubbles, that is the real estate prices, as well as the tremors in the Wall Street casino, where 1,000 people currently have occupied it, set the US Treasury into a downward spiral. The net effect of 9/11, and this is definitely a consequence of 9/11 for the US economy, has meant the downgrade in the US federal debt to AA+ from the risk-free rating of AAA. Standard & Poor's, which gives out these ratings, explained its actions in the following way. The downgrade reflects our view that the effectiveness, stability, and predictability of American policy making and political institutions have weakened at a time of ongoing fiscal and economic challenge. The problem for Standard & Poor's was not the economy per se, but the political imbroglio and political myopia within the United States. The Republican Party, heir to neoconservative domestic and foreign policy, is unable to either restructure the economic or military objectives for the country. For them, the budget must be balanced, in other words, no more foreign debt, but there can be no foreshortening of military expenditure. Indeed, what the Republicans want is already the case in the United States, with spending on social goods at an anemic low level. In fact, from Monthly Review, one learns that in the United States for the last 100 years, social spending has not risen above 14.5% of gross domestic product. It's been pretty much kept low, and we can discuss this later. What are the implications of this political attempt to keep the social spending so low over the past 100 years? Okay. No wonder that the Census Bureau announced just recently that there are now 46.2 million people living under the rather low poverty line in the United States. That is 1 in 6 people are officially poor. That's the highest percentage since 1983. The jobless rate and the rate of those without health insurance is also inching up to record-breaking levels. 22% of children in the United States live under the poverty line. That's the worst figure since 1962. So Obama's announcement recently of $447 billion, I mean, put this in the context of $7.6 trillion in military and defense spending. Obama's announcement of $447 billion toward job creation is not only a drop in the economic bucket, but of course that bucket, as I said, has 2 major holes in it. One hole is tax cut, the other hole is military expenditure. It's not only that, but it's totally wrong. It's a wrong-sided approach. In other words, in the question and answer, I'm happy to talk about why I think a Keynesian strategy today is ridiculous. Why Keynesianism is not what one should champion. Keynesianism's day is over, and we can talk about that later. Okay, so the Republican strategy is bogus, but the strategy of the Krugmans and others of a kind of reinvigorated 21st century Keynesianism is equally absurd. Okay, so there is no political will in the country now to reverse course. The project for a new American centuries plan is now in the DNA of the American political establishment. You know, after 9/11, when people were reading the Project for a New American Century, the idea was these are a bunch of crazies who hijacked the system. But what I'm trying to suggest to you is that nobody hijacked the system. The system, in fact, is along the grain of what the Project for the New American Century proposed. That is indeed what occurred. What occurred is what this system is geared to pushing. No other alternative would have been possible given the structure that we have. Prior to 9/11, the United States had its eyes fixed on China. After Tiananmen Square 1989, the United States suspended many of its economic and trade relations with the People's Republic of China. The US Trade and Development Agency's work was suspended, and restrictions emerged for munitions, arms. The most favored trading thing was annulled. There was a real push against China. William Triplett, great name, a senior Republican foreign policy expert. After 9/11, people had looked at the Project for a New American Century. But this is an interesting thing. William Triplett, senior Republican political strategy man, created a group in the early 1990s called the Blue Team, with the express interest of ratcheting up conflict with China. It was known as the Blue Team. Its view of China was well defined by the right-wing Weekly Standard, which described China as a regime of hair-curling systematic barbarity. You see, when I read that hair-curling system, I immediately thought of North Korea, because, you know, they are the ones with the hair. Chinese leadership, I think, wants for hair until recently. The old guard by the 1990s. The Blue Team was strengthened by the military and economic tensions between the rising power in Asia and the stagnant power in the United States. Many of the Blue Team's personnel shared a vision of the world with the project of a new American century. Both worried about the decline in US influence and wanted to tackle the challenges in the Middle East, that was a project for a new American century, and East Asia, and that was the blue team. And they wanted to strike a challenge not through any other way but straightforward military belligerency. In 1996, the United States and China clashed over China's operations in the Taiwan Straits. 2 United States aircraft carriers rushed in to defend China. This was the third Taiwan Straits moment of tension, crisis I guess it's called. The third Taiwan Straits crisis in 1996. A gradual melt in relations occurred with the exchange of leaders in both directions, but this was threatened by the bombing of the Chinese embassy in Belgrade in 1999 and by the bringing down of a US EP-3 spy plane on Hainan Island in 2001. US threats in the late spring of 2001 to build its missile defense units to ring China were taken as the ultimate hostile action. If any of you remember, the spring of 2001, it really looked like the United States was going to conduct some kind of armed expedition against China. It looked like that to me. Things got so tense that in July 2001, Bush's Secretary of State Colin Powell went to Beijing to say, my presence here today is an example of trying to let the world know, this sentence is great. My presence here today is an example of trying to let the world see that we are not an enemy and we are not looking for an enemy. We are looking for ways to cooperation. Okay. The tensions didn't break and cooperation seemed impossible. 9/11 shifted US attention from China. The global war on terror sapped the energy and wealth of the United States and brought it to its present impasse. Meanwhile, China has been able to build up its own economic prowess. You know, China is an interesting place. Essentially, the Chinese foreign policy is at the level of the, of 1648, the Treaty of Westphalia. They have not advanced from the Treaty of Westphalia. They believe in the idea that every state should have its own policy. In other words, they'll do business, but they don't interfere with your policy. You know, that's where they have been until recently. So over this last period, under cover of the global war on terror, the Chinese have been making deals with everybody, building ports in Pakistan, in Sri Lanka, airports in Africa, new trade deals, etc. Okay. Meanwhile, China has been able to build up its own economic prowess, sitting as it is on trillions of dollars in surplus. At the Dalian meeting this last week of the World Economic Forum, their summer meeting, Chinese Premier Wen Jiabao was asked about the crisis in Europe and the United States. So Wen answered quite tactfully, but for a Chinese leadership, as I said, which believes that the Treaty of Westphalia is the mode of acting in foreign policy arenas, quite forcefully, because this is very unusual language. So Wen Jiabao said, as the 2 largest advanced economies in the world, it's funny that he said that, because the IMF recently had a report out saying that in 2016, China is going to have the largest economy in the world, which will be the first time since 1927 that the United States has been supplanted as the largest economy in the world. If we had time, I'd go over the whole Arrighi theory, which seems to be playing itself out very, very clearly in this transfer of economic centers. Okay, he says, as the 2 largest advanced economies in the world, the European Union and the United States should adopt promptly and resolutely responsible fiscal and financial policies and push forward policy adjustment and institutional reform as soon as possible so as to cut budget deficits and ease the debt pressure. Now, the other word Wen Jiabao used is, we will help shore up the European Central Bank if the Europeans abide by certain conditions. Now, anybody who's lived or has read anything about the global south knows that the word conditions is an extremely big buzzword. Admittedly, when the IMF used the term, they never said conditions. They always used the term conditionalities. That's because they have their own made-up language. You know, we're going to give you bridge structural adjustment loan, but you must abide by certain conditionalities. Well, Wen Jiabao said, you must abide by certain conditions. Now, his conditions were interesting. He said that the Chinese will give money if Europe recognizes China as a market economy. And that's important because that means the Europeans then, who consider China now a non-market economy, keep suing the Chinese for trade barriers. If they recognize it as a market economy, those lawsuits will have no standing. Then every lawsuit will have to be taken on its merits. So Wen Jiabao says that. Wen Jiabao also said that you have to adjust your policies and you have to create institutional reform. I mean, this is the language that the IMF uses, IMF chief, when they show up in like Kazakhstan, you know. So that was Wen Jiabao's statement to the Europeans. Of course, we know that such measures are not feasible because of the politics that we have, that will not even begin to consider these kind of reforms. One of the consequences of the way in which United States policy was formed after September 11, 2001 was to do precisely what the Blue Team and the Project for a New American Century feared. It delivered the momentum to China. So having delivered the momentum to China, one has to see that as a consequence of 9/11. Now I'm going to shift gears and go to another thing, and then we'll come back. Okay, we're together so far? Some of it is for you summary. But I thought I'll give you a summary because a lot of this is forgotten. So here it is. Okay. Well, by some more facts. One, by 2016, the United States will not be the largest economy in the world. Important to remember. By 2050, the country will be a minority-majority country, which is also interesting, demographically. By 2034, the United States will be as unequal as Mexico. Yeah, 2034. But you said wow to that. Did you know that the United States today has a higher rate of inequality than Pakistan and Iran? No. Well, that's another one for your fact book.
Wow, that's another one.
I have some more of these stats. So, by 2050, by 2016, no more first economy. By 2050, majority minority. By 2034, inequality rates up to the situation today in Mexico. So that means by 2050, people of color will inherit a broken country, one that is ready to be turned around for good or for ill. As with all things, the moment people of color show up, they are given the broken car. Welcome, you get equal rights, but the state is broke. So you have equal rights, but there's no housing loans for you. Welcome, you're a majority population, but the country is broke. So the question is, are we prepared for the world of decline? And that's what I'm going to go over a little bit. Okay? The first question is, who is we? Because that's the Lone Ranger question, you know. Who is we, Kimosabe? Who is we? Not the elite political class in the United States. The elite political class is not capable of dealing with this transformation, by which I mean Democrat, Republican, Obama, Boyer. They're all, to me, one planet. Okay? For me, there is no good, bad, you know, better, evil, whatever. They are one political class. They have no imagination to deal with this crisis. They are tinkering around with the crisis. Many of them will refuse to admit that the crisis exists. Okay, and they refuse to admit it to their own population because they'll continue to say, we live in the greatest country in the world. Well, define that. You know, a simple, you know, English 101, define your terms. You know, greatest means what? Country. You know, what is a country? What is a city? What is New York? It's certainly not your city. So, the elite class is deluded into the belief that the United States can enjoy another American century, and that if only the Chinese revalue their currency, everything would be back to the golden age. It is also deluded into the belief that the toxic rhetoric about taking back the country is going to silence the darker bodies who have tasted freedom since 1965 and want more of it. Okay? Nobody's buying the take back the country. Everybody knows take back the country means circa 1925, and I don't want to live in America 1925. I like it now, fine. So I'm not going to, you know, that idea of taking back the country produces what Ejaz Ahmed called the cultures of cruelty. By cultures of cruelty, what Ejaz means is and this is his line, the wider web of social sanctions in which one kind of violence can be tolerated all the more because many other kinds of violence are tolerated anyway. Okay? So culture of cruelty is a wider web of social sanctions. There should never be W's in sentences that people from South Asia read. It's like so many years I still can't read a W properly. Cultures of cruelty is a wider web of social sanctions in which one kind of violence will be tolerated or can be tolerated all the more because many other kinds of violence are tolerated anyway. So police brutality, domestic violence, ICE raids against undocumented workers, all of them, including the comical mimicry of the foreign accent, all of them, aerial bombardment in the borderlands of Afghanistan, sanctified misogyny in our cinema, all these things are routine forms of violence, and they set the stage for a more generalized ethical numbness toward cruelty. It is on this prepared terrain of cruelty that the forces of the far right, including, of course, the Tea Party, can make their hallowed appearance. They're ready to dance on the misfortunes and struggles of migrants, workers, and the dispossessed. The pre-existing cultures of cruelty sustain the far right and allow it to appear increasingly normal, taking back the country from you-know-who. And if the cultures of cruelty make the far right seem increasingly normal, they make the near right seem decidedly normal, meaning the Democratic Party, which is equally lunatic, but it somehow seems less bad. Yes, sir?
I just want to get a clarification. You mentioned before the word deluded. I just keeping my own note as to what you're saying. What do you mean by deluded? Who is deluded?
Where did I say deluded? Did I say deluded?
That the American elites were...
Oh, the American elites are deluded. Yes.
No, are they aware of this delusion?
No, that I don't know. Unfortunately, I don't get much access to them. Their statements are deluded. What they say sounds at variance to reality.
But do you think that would you entertain
No, it's
the
okay.
idea that they would be actually enjoying it?
Very good point. And this comes precisely to the idea of cultures of cruelty. Well, for instance, if a politician says that, we need to tighten up our borders, there is a kind of, I would say, a sadistic pleasure. Because they must know that tightening borders means the great humiliation and violence against ordinary people who are just struggling to make a living. So in that sense, they must, either they are genuinely deluded, or this is a kind of performed delusion. But I can't speak to that. My statement about their delusion is not so much about their intention, but about that I can only read it as delusion. I do not want to assume that people graduating from Harvard, Yale, and Princeton are that stupid. Either they are performing delusion for our purposes, or they are unable to see the full effect of their rhetoric and their policies. That's what I mean. Okay. So the rights menagerie, and by right again I will include both political parties, the rights menagerie sniffs at all the opportunities. It is prepared, it's exerting itself, feeding off a culture that has delivered a disarmed population into its fangs. So they don't know how to solve the crisis, but they are ready for 2034 and 2050, but only in the most harmful way. It is we who are totally unprepared. In fact, I don't think we've even thought about the fact that this is the world that we are going to inherit in the next few decades. Our social bloc is less organized than it was a generation ago. And then, let's not, I don't go to union membership, all that stuff, forget all that. See, what 2034, 2050, 2016, what the story I've told us of, decline, the use of 9/11 to bring the United States closer to a place of decline and to a culture of cruelty, what these call out to us for is a more mature political landscape. So, but to clear the way for it, we need to germinate, to my mind, intense cultural activity, to penetrate new ideas into the domain of culture, to lift the conversation from the day-to-day to new horizons, to the potential of creating new political spaces, new epochs. The cultural work calls upon intellectuals and artists like ourselves to set aside some time for the future. Not just for the moment, for the crisis, but for the future. So what I mean by that is, when hope is so meagerly or poorly organized to reshape culture, when hope can be so quickly commodified, we tend to then turn and expect too much of politicians that are there, even intellectuals, artists. We ask us to do the work of transformation, to change everything, and that is, I think, has led many people into gloom. Because as A, the politicians betray you, or B, writers are not able to create the new horizon itself, there is gloom. Many writers I know fall into despair, say that we cannot act anymore because we don't know what to say. The forces of evil are so widely ranged against us. What can we put forward as our message? I mean, what I think of when I think of these spaces where we come and discuss, the seminar we held earlier, place like Breck Forum, million other opportunities people have to interact and fight and talk seriously about these crises. These are the kind of experiments we need to create across the country, alluding to reality with conversations between us, some artists, some intellectuals, people of different backgrounds, at the same time doing something that many such projects don't do. I mean, we need to create democratic audiences, incubate new small spaces. Earlier I was talking about how it's important to create new radical imaginations even. You know, I take faith in small movements when people are building, say, collectives to produce some kind of new way of imagining how to live in the future. In the town I live in, a group of people decided to start removing the trash from homes by bicycle. And they have sustained it over, I think, the last 5 years. It's a small cooperative, they run horizontally, and they have modeled for the community how a business can succeed. Because after all, it's an enterprise. They don't do this out of charity, they're not funded by a non-profit, but they have modeled for people how to exist in a different space. They have created and pushed the radical imagination. They are not the future. Those acts of radical challenge, of new possibilities, aren't themselves solving the problems. They are simply providing spaces to expand the radical imagination. I hope you understand what I'm saying. I'm not saying, I hope all of us join little collectives. No, those collectives, their role is to expand the imagination because they are not just telling this is what should happen. They are demonstrating. They are trying to produce cultural change. Okay, that's what I believe. The toxic soup of our present draws from the worst inventory of the past to blind us to those who struggle to survive. So, near where I live in Springfield, there is a city which suffers the worst foreclosure rate in New England. And yet there are people in the city who have created a coalition, people who are in the foreclosure sector, as it were, who created a coalition called No One Leaves. And they have fought the city council. Some of the spaces that are utilized by them, things like a farmer's market, where new cultural possibilities are imagined by communities, where people have learned to trust each other. These are very important zones. It's through there, they forced the city council to pass an amendment which says that any bank that tries to foreclose on a house has to pay $10,000. That means it's punitive for banks to foreclose. In fact, a few days ago, the banks have started to push back, saying we are not going to lend in Springfield. So Springfield is a front line of a new challenge to banks, but it comes out of germinated radical cultural activity. That's a small scale. People have built communities through things that don't look like political struggle, but political consequences have emerged out of them. And Max was saying earlier that we ask why do we have the US Social Forum? Why was there the Cairo Social Forum? Out of those social forums, nothing concrete is going to come. But in those spaces, people who are active in different areas have created networks. They've created trust. They've contacted each other. I mean, what the toxic soup that the broad right has produced in America now is the denial of community. So the production of community, I think, is a very important incubator of the new radical imagination. That one has to fight to find ways to build new communities. Okay, just a few minutes more and then I'll... So, the culture of cruelty that has emerged, I would say, that is the gift. If on the macro scale, the gift of 9/11 was the bankrupting of the United States, the hastening of the end, in a sense, of the American empire's ability to sustain its military power. And then only 3 pillars remain for American military superiority, American hegemonic superiority. One will be intellectual property rights. We can talk about that later. Another is going to be the US dollar, and the third is going to be the military. If the military is already an unsustainable way to maintain US hegemony, if the dollar is under threat, as it is under threat, the only thing the United States has to hold on to preserve and expand its hegemony is intellectual property regimes, and those are very fragile. If that is the macro stage, on the micro stage, we are going to have to engage with problems of this culture of cruelty. And the suggestion I have to go forward on that is I'll read a little poem from Brecht, and then I hope this will clarify in the discussion. Okay. All right. This is from Brecht, 1938. The critical attitude strikes many people as unfruitful. That is because they find the state impervious to their criticism. But what in this case is an unfruitful attitude is merely a feeble attitude. Give criticism arms and states can be demolished by it. Canalizing a river, grafting a fruit tree, educating a person, transforming a state, these are instances of fruitful criticism and at the same time instances of art. Thank you.
Thank you, Vijay. With that, I'd like to start the discussion period. Yes, okay, go ahead. And can you introduce, whenever if you say your first name at least, so we understand who each other.
Malcolm, thank you so much, Vijay, for presenting and talking tonight. You spoke about why Keynesian economics isn't going to work in the future, and you said that you might be willing to talk about that. I'd be very interested to know why you don't think that will work in the future.
Yes, this is something I'm thinking a lot about. Why? Because many of my friends that other Marxists or others have been writing a lot about reviving a kind of New Deal position for the United States. Or people are saying the government should spend more. But the question is, Keynesianism of what kind? Spending of what kind? So what typically is meant by Keynesianism is where government comes in and primes the pump, perhaps through, maybe giving, infrastructure, for instance. Let's build more bridges, let's build more this. The Bay Bridge is being rebuilt in San Francisco. You may have followed this. They're building an incredible bridge, one massive pillar and steel, 34 ribbons of steel knotted together. Now, what they discovered, so they got money from not federal government, but state government. But had they got money from the federal government, they would have had a problem. Because the steel they are using for that bridge is made in China. And it is monumentally cheaper in China. So you can do as much infrastructural spending in the United States. You're not necessarily going to actually incubate an industrial sector in the United States, and you cannot. It's not rational. Industrial sector in the United States cannot be brought back into the United States because American labor is too expensive. And it will always be too expensive unless you have a socialist plan. So Keynesian plan, to my mind, is always going to be a fake smoke and mirrors thing. You'll do advances and then outsource a lot of stuff. What is the real plan for reviving America? That argument, that I can give it to you in 2 minutes, and I will in a second. But the Keynesian plan, it should be clear, essentially is a smoke and mirror. That we give money for infrastructure, a lot of the materials are going to come from abroad. Because precisely now, physical plants have been allowed to completely, they have basically been wiped out through arbitrage selling, asset stripping in the 1980s when Goldman and others asset stripped the Midwest, sold plants for scrap. In fact, many of the whole factories were put on ships and taken to China. You may have seen many stories like that. The entire machinery is gone and retrofitted, etc. So what is an alternative? What is a socialist plan? Not this Keynesian smoke and mirror. What I would think is essential in countries like the United States is to make it possible for me to earn a lower salary so that my wages are competitive in the planet. Now, you say that, what? A socialist saying give people less? Completely heresy. But this is how it would operate. The government needs to shore up the social wage. Right now, everything in my life is privatized. If I need to get to damn work, I have to drive in my car. I have to buy car insurance. If I fall ill, I need insurance. My health, my retirement is privatized, largely. Work puts in some, I puts in, that's a shell game, but largely it's my responsibility. If I need to put kids into even public college, the fees are $12,000 a year. If the government comes in and actually uses that taxed money to shore up the social wage, so that I had good quality public transport, no need for a car. Many people around the world they have, let's take the case of Denmark, where Helle Smith has just won the election. She said, I'm going to tax the rich and build up the social wage. That actually is an old social democratic idea. I won't have to have a car. If we have universal health care, the firm has its weight lifted off its books, because then it won't have to pay into health care. The firm, if we had actual pension, universal pension, wouldn't have to pay bloody social security. Auto companies cannot upgrade their physical plant because they are burdened by social security and health care. So whatever profits are coming which go to the plutocrats, the rest goes into social security and health care. So what the state needs to do is to create a robust social wage which removes from my books the upkeep of my daily life. Then I can take a lower wage. If I didn't have to take all those things, I wouldn't need such a big salary. That's one piece of it. The second piece of it, we do need a massive cultural project in the country to change up our habits of consuming alone. That you need 12 TVs in a house. That's the end of social life. Everything needs to be inside my house. There is no social community center where people hang out and play Wii together. Okay, like a college. Why can't life be like college? But now, my friends, in college dorms, they're playing Wii in their rooms, not in the common room, because there's no more common room. So where are the common spaces? So my sense, a real socialist plan would say, socialize many of the things in life that why should ordinary people have to take care of? Why should I have to bloody spend hours on the phone with the insurance company trying to get repaid? I took a flight, I bought a ticket on some airline, and I bought insurance from the airline. I spent hours on the phone trying to get my money back. You see, why do we allow the tensions of these ridiculous things be individualized? So a socialist plan would say the government comes in, socializes these means of delivery of basic things, health, education, transportation, etc. Now, you can still have a car, but you don't need 2 cars in the house or 3 cars. You can get on public transport, take your bicycle, etc. So that's a socialist plan to re-engineer the United States. But my God, politically that is absolute toxic thinking. It sounds like a lunatic, To me, it sounds totally rational. To me, the Keynesian model is unrealistic because A, the politics does not allow it. If American politics currently doesn't allow the Keynesian plan, why should people on the left defend a Keynesian plan? We should be articulating a radical socialist plan. There's no point articulating a more realistic plan that's unrealistic. We should try to push the radical imagination further. That is why I believe that people who articulate the Keynesian plan are not only deluded, they are deluding the population. I'm using that word again. So that's why I don't believe Keynesianism is possible, because we are too expensive. That's a real issue.
Does anyone else want to follow up on this point in terms of their comments or questions?
Between 86 and what was it? It was signed in 2003, something like that. And in between the WTO was created. That Uruguay round, the main issue was trade-related intellectual property rights, and the other one, TRIPS and TRIMS, trade-related investment, TRIMS and TRIPS. Basically, the United States expended all the capital in that because without that, absent that, we would not be able to sustain our jobless growth economy today. So when people say we need more intellectual thing, information technology, IT, stuff like that, what that essentially means is a very small section of the population needs to be educated. They produce some new commodity, the idea of the commodity, that commodity is patented. The actual commodities are produced in Malaysia, Mexico, and China, so there's no mass jobs in America. These people then are able to collect rent of that, the sale of those goods. And then they, with the massive rents they collect, thanks to the intellectual property laws, hire gardeners, bankers, and others to protect their patents, beautify the houses, they go out to eat. That's our economy. That's the information economy, but it's actually a jobless economy. So people who say, let us push the information economy, you're pushing a jobless economy. The green economy is also a chimera right now because it will require massive political will. The Chinese are leading in solar panel development. The US government tried to finance a solar panel firm. What happened to it last week? Went bankrupt. I mean, so there's a fundamental problem underneath, which nobody's tackling, which I believe is the problem that wages are too high. There is a severe cultural problem, and that needs to be transformed.
Okay. Thank you. Liz?
You haven't said much yet about the Arab Spring. Could you comment on?
That was Max's idea, 9/11 to the Arab Spring.
Because you've been following the issues.
Yes.
Yes. So, yeah, we'd like to hear a little bit about what you see happening there and so forth.
Well, I shall tell you that in spring of 2012, from AK Press will come my book, Arab Spring, Libyan Winter. It is right here. It is done now. I am re-editing it. I'll tell you the last line. That'll give you a sense of it. The last line is, what is the last line? The last line is, may it be so. Anyway, the basically my argument is quite straightforward, which is that, you know, this didn't happen in December 2010. This has been happening for a long time. In Egypt, for instance, there have been struggles over at least the last 10 years. Places like the industrial town of Mahalla, there's been strikes from 2006. In Tunisia, in the mining areas, there's been strikes for the last, 8 years. There's been police firing. I mean, these countries have incubated struggles. Tunisia and Egypt and Yemen and Bahrain, these four have incubated serious civil society, not the boring civil society, but meaning ordinary people, working people struggles of different kinds. In Egypt, in fact, there is like Doctors for Change, Lawyers for Change. You know, there are all bizarre groups. Plus, in Egypt, during the Second Intifada, there was a major solidarity campaign which formed the bedrock of the Tahrir Square network, the Second Intifada. Then there was the campaigns against the Iraq war. They formed organizations. You know, what is it, March 20th, April 6th. All these names are related to actual events. You see on CNN, they say, here's somebody from the March 6th movement. Well, what the hell was the March 6th movement? You know, they don't tell us. It's not March 6th last year, it's back then, 2003, some in the 90s. So they have been incubating struggles. That is there. That is important. It was definitely not Facebook. Because in 28th January, Mubarak closed down internet and cell use. And a new study has found that after January 28th, the protests were even more spectacular. Because people then had to go and talk to each other. And old networks were revived. You know, it was magisterial. Not, but that has to be linked to the things like Russian wheat harvest collapsed last year. You know, bread prices went up. You have to remember that in Egypt, they had the so-called democracy of bread subsidies. Like all revolutions, it turns on bread. The French Revolution turned on bread. Egypt Revolution turned on bread. In the last minute, Mubarak said, I'll return the subsidy. And people said, no, we want you to go now. Subsidy will come later. You know, so the bread was the conjunctural issue. Food prices around the world have gone up. United States didn't feel the food prices problem because we are largely self-sufficient in grains. You know, so we didn't actually feel the inflation dramatically. But the rest of the world, it has been catastrophic. There have been protests in most of the continents around food. But in the Arab, it's Libya that I was very interested in. Why, like, you know, Naim and I have had our childhood somewhat, at least brief periods in Libya. So you were there in which year? 75 to 79. Libya I remember driving from Alexandria to Tripoli and seeing all those, the deserts were lined with German and British munitions. You may not know, but in Libya, between 1950 and 1972, the biggest export from Libya was scrap metal. Because they were exporting the metal from all the munitions of the Battle of, you know, Tobruk, the Battle of, which one? Tobruk was the big one, Benghazi. Then Al Alamein, just across the border. These were the second biggest export from Libya was Halfa, Esparto. The fancy paper is made of Esparto grass. Anyway, Libya was interesting because Libya has had another kind of fight. And my book is mainly about Libya. In Libya, from 2000 at least, or actually earlier than that, in the late 90s, the UN sanctions of 98 had a catastrophic impact on the Gaddafi regime. And in the 90s, Gaddafi had attempted to make his peace to end the sanctions. So he sent Moussa Koussa, his henchman, around the world, paying Libyan money to solve the problem of Lockerbie, to solve the problem of the Niger plain with the French. And they got the sanctions removed. And so they began to privatize rapidly the state. In Libya, even barbershops were state barbershops. Everything was nationalized. It's crazy. I don't want to live in a society where everything is nationalized. Only the commanding heights. Some things should be in the hands of people. He nationalized everything, including mosques. You know, essentially the Waqf property was in the hands of the state. The imams had to answer to the Libyan authority. So, in between 2006 it starts in earnest. 2006 to 2010, there was a major debate in the Libyan elite, in the Tripoli ruling bloc. And the debate there was over privatization. And Saif al-Islam Gaddafi was the head of that. And he brought back exiles, Libyan diasporics, like for instance, Tariq Ben Halim, who was a Goldman Sachs partner, and the son of the last prime minister of Idris's reign, before the Gaddafi coup in '69. Ben Halim's father was the prime minister. So Tariq Ben Halim goes back to fix the banks, and he brings with him the Oxford Group, McKinsey. Then Mohammed Jibril is brought back. He was a financial consultant to the second wife of the Sheikh of Qatar. The relationship with Qatar goes back to a while back. So from Doha, Jibril comes back, and they work with Saif al-Islam. They are a group to privatize, to move Libya in a neoliberal direction. In fact, Saif al-Islam, best line he ever said, he said, Libyans want to eat McDonald's, not uranium, when Libya gave up the nuclear thing. So they wanted to make essentially Libya into Kuwait on the Mediterranean. But there was a big battle inside the ruling clique. And the neoliberals found their way blocked. And Ben Halim resigned. Mahmoud Jibril threatened to resign 3 times but never did. And Saif al-Islam also threatened to resign. So what is bizarre is when February 15th starts in Benghazi, that is another story. That has to do with political Islam. It has to do with the protest march in 2006 against the Danish cartoon controversy. You know, there was a groundswell of opposition. When the actual protest begins and it gets strong, and Benghazi is taken in like 3 days, Benghazi is taken. The regime was extremely brittle. Jibril, Shokri Ghanem, all the neoliberals become rebels, like this. And they left Gaddafi with the old guard who hated Gaddafi. So it's a bizarre political landscape suddenly. The old guard, which wanted a more nationalized, national democratic kind of state, was stuck with Gaddafi, who they had hated since the early 90s. Now they are all in a terrible position. And the guys who tried to liberalize Libya in a kind of World Bank, IMF direction suddenly became the champions of free Libya. So I found that to be very interesting. And equally, I was very interested in how there was a false dilemma posed even in the American left between do you intervene to stop a massacre or do you allow a massacre to happen? That is what is called a false dilemma. Because only 2 options were given, massacre or NATO intervention. And I thought that was very unfortunate. In fact, I was very shocked to see so many people on the left supporting intervention, thinking that that false dilemma was the only one. You know why? Because by end February, the rebellion had seized aircraft. They had bombed a ship in the Gulf of Sidra. The dynamic was with the rebellion. They were going to get slaughtered as well, but they had the dynamic. Brigadiers were defecting to the rebellion. I mean, I have the details of which brigadier defected with how many troops, which day. By end February, the defections to the rebellions had increased greatly. But it's at that time that I think the neoliberals felt that their position was weakening in the National Transitional Council. Abdul Jalil was the head. He is the interior minister of Gaddafi. The guy who comes to take over the military is also Gaddafi's security man. Major General Yunus, Fateh Yunus comes. Of course, at that moment, flying in from Vienna, Virginia is the CIA's favorite Libyan, you know, Khalifa Hiftar comes to become number 3 in the military. When Fateh Yunus is killed, now Hiftar is in charge of the military. He used to live in 5 minutes from Langley. So, I mean, my basic argument is that Libya provided the Americans an opportunity, and the French in particular, to re-establish the dynamic of their supremacy in the region. At least what they think is their supremacy. But from below, they have no control. In Tripoli today, it appears that most of the wall writing and many of the people in charge are old school Islamists who lost their lives in this fight, and they are not willing to give up Libya to France. And so there is a big battle on the ground. I don't know. The one dangerous and difficult thing is that, and maybe it's good, that the Libyan militias refused to come under unified command. They fought like we are the Misrata rebels. We are the Lanouf rebels. They refused a united command. That means everybody is armed. And that's not a very good situation if this breaks out into a position of war, like internal fight. It's like Kabul, 1996. So I don't know whether that is going to go. But what I know is that the Americans and French played a dirty game in Libya. Terrible. And I'm sorry to say many progressive media went along with it, hook, line, and sinker. I did not agree at all. They didn't ask questions. Because that false dilemma is the most dangerous dilemma. It was there in the Gulf War I, when people like Fred Halliday defended the US invasion into Iraq. It was there in Yugoslavia, when many people that I respected said the bombing of Kosovo was a good idea. So.
I'm going to ask, I see a couple of people, but I'm going to ask people who haven't spoken yet. So,
That was a bit long, sorry.
okay, who would like to comment or ask a question?
Please.
I'm looking to see if people have already.
Somebody wants to go ahead and
Yeah, is there anybody who hasn't spoken yet before we go back?
No pressure, huh? Don't.
Huh? Okay, you had your hand up too? Okay, go ahead.
going back to delusion.
Yes.
I think I'm a little bit left of you, maybe. I don't know.
Never mind.
But I just see so many things happening that okay. I see so many things happening in America and the world that strike me to prove against this idea of delusion. That so many very definitive things are occurring. Whether it be, for instance, the Keystone Pipeline that's going to go from Alberta to Mexico, that abolishes the pollution. I see, and the pollution they just talked about that Wyoming now has worse smog than Los Angeles. I think that the unhealthiest air in America, this is Wyoming. These are very horrific developments. The BP oil spill, our connection with BP, our lack of really being able to even do anything about the spill, and continue to allow and encourage more, really. It seems like it's not delusion so much that these people are under. It seems as if they are basically going about a step-to-step destruction and, shall we say, reaccounting of the entire economics of the world, to the point where only 2% of the entire population of the world has all the money. And it just doesn't seem so delusional to me. It seems very purposeful, very controlled, very thoughtful.
I know, I think we won't actually, there may not be that much of a gap between you and me. I mean, you're right. I mean, one thing I would say is I think that even the powerful cannot control everything. But what they can, what they can control, for instance, I agree with you with the drilling, for instance, that, there's a kind of reckless endangerment in the behavior toward nature. No doubt about that. Fracking is another example. It's recklessly endangered. And then they'll say it was an accident. Okay? If there is some disaster, they'll say, oh, I'm sorry this happened. Building nuclear power plants on fault lines, like at San Onofre, that was built in the 1950s on a fault line in California. Fukushima, they didn't build the plant on the other side of the island because they were afraid the North Koreans would strike it with a missile. So they built it this side where a tsunami can strike it. I mean, it's reckless endangerment, and it's playing with people's lives. So there I agree, there is a great deal of purpose. But I think that given that they are predisposed to power and reckless endangerment, they still think that they can control the future. And it is that belief that they control the future that I think is a delusion. And the reason I think that is because I think they cannot control the future. They can control, it's okay, that's fine. They can control institutions. They can control certain institutions, but that's not the future. They can control money. They can control the flow of capital a little bit. That is the financiers. They can control, where drilling happens, but that's not the future. I would like our radical imagination to reclaim the future. The future is ours, it's not theirs. See, their future is only reckless endangerment towards destruction. That's not the future. That's hell. So their path leads to hell. Our path leads to the future. In that sense, they are deluded thinking their path will go to our end. Their path is only in one direction. And we should never allow them to claim the future. So that's what I mean by delusion.
Yes, in the back.
Fareed Zakaria argues in his work, and I was wondering what your thoughts were on that.
By the way, not to knock the opening of your thing, but in Gaddafi's room, he was found with summaries of Fareed Zakaria's The Post-American World, George Soros' new book, and his favorite apparently was, apart from Condoleezza Rice, was Thomas Friedman. So anyway, just to give you, I accumulate all the tidbits about that family. It's kind of an obsession, and it's been for a long time. But in fact, I can tell you one other, anyway, that you'll find here. I know who taught him how to drive. That is in here.
We'll have a book party.
Who taught Gaddafi how to drive. Anyway. Yeah, the rise of the rest. I mean, I learned so much from Fareed Zakaria's father. He was a really careful, serious scholar of tolerance in India. He was a major intellectual of the kind of nationalist secular school, Rafiq Zakaria, very, very, solid scholar. Fareed Zakaria has fallen into a certain kind of trap. It's a kind of American commentariat trap of the, it's like the Thomas Friedman school of writing. It's kind of a glib statements about the planet, It's not the decline of America, it's the rise of the rest, fellas. So everybody relax, stay on course, Just be nicer to the Brazilians, be nicer to the Indians, and everything will be fine. But, if you look at the political economy of the United States, it's not fine. It's not the rise of the rest. This economy is not sustainable. It is not possible to re-engineer jobs. When Robert Reich, who is the smartest liberal economist in politics, ran for governor of Massachusetts, I remember he came to Western Mass and I went to his event. He's a great speaker, really interesting. The most he could say is that we need, in Western Mass, a place that is the epitome of jobless growth. We need to re-engineer the bioengineering sector, biomedical sector. Now, all that he's saying is we need to have 60 people, PhDs, who have come from India and China and somewhere else, finish their things in good universities in America, finishing schools, and are now in a corridor in Massachusetts coming up with incredible devices which are going to be manufactured in China, the same old story. In other words, the models that we have for contemporary growth in America are not sustainable. So it's not a question of the rise of the rest. It's the supplanting of America that we have to deal with. And if this analysis is correct, that it's military power, it's the international treaties on intellectual property, which allow for job growth, and if it's the dollar, this is a very flimsy foundation to maintain the status, if that's all we have. So there is something actually truer in the bilious writings of the right wing, who write about how manufacturing is destroyed. Because they are much more honest about the need to bring back manufacturing. They are actually at the heart of the problem, but they are all wrong in their analysis. They have identified the correct issue. But you cannot create a sustainable economy with this model. And Zakaria cannot see him out of that paper bag. Because he's not interested in economics. All he wants is American government should behave better to others. It's a foreign policy universe of people being gentlemen. That's how he sees it. And I think that's not a model. It's not enough to say Obama is in power now, and when he goes elsewhere, people like him. That's not going to help America. After all, Obama gave a standing ovation speech in Cairo in 2009. And in that speech, he said, "We reach out our hand, will you not give us a fist back?" In Tahrir Square, people were chanting, "We are reaching out our hand, why are you putting a fist back at us?" And in their hand, they had tear gas canisters which said, "Made in the USA." Psych. So it's not a question of better attitude. And that, I think, is the limitation of the commentariat. That's the best they can do for us.
And say your name again.
My name's Malcolm. VJ, I agree with you completely as far as economics. There's a program coming out on BS BOD on Tuesday. And what we're doing is we're going to foreign countries and recruiting healthcare workers to come over and provide healthcare. The program The Learning is about teachers from the Philippines who are recruited by a school system, secondary school system here in the U.S. because we have a shortage of math and science teachers. So we're going to foreign countries, we're bringing in people who have math and science skills to teach here. But yet we have a job shortage. It's just really amazing, like, at what point are we going to bring in foreign workers to do labor here when we're not training the native populace to do so?
And why can't we train the native populace?
Which is a great question to ask. Why can't we train the native population, whatever country it is? Because if you're going to practice this type of capitalism, it's not sustainable on the planet. People are having to leave their families. It causes a stress. And in this program, they talk about the stress in the family in the Philippines because the mom leaves the entire family. So if we're going to practice this type of capitalism, it's not really sustainable for our planet and our community. I wanted to ask you, as far as you talked about the involvement of the U.S. and France and Libya, one of the things that when you look at covert operations, you look at the blowback that's been happening years later, and one could argue that 9/11 is actually a blowback from U.S. policies in the past. What do you see as substantial blowback and the forces that may be there that would cause that blowback in Libya, but also you have to also look at Egypt as well?
I mean, it's hard to, there's no straight line. If you read Chalmers Johnson's book, Blowback, and his trilogy, he died last year, interesting man. There is no straight line from X event. I mean, who would have forecast that the entry of US troops into Saudi Arabia to remove the Iraqis from Kuwait would create, in a sense, Al-Qaeda? I mean, it's like butterflies. Nobody, no CIA planner, it's there in Michael Scher's book. It was a surprise to them that the spur for Al-Qaeda was the US troops coming to throw out. They thought, George W. Bush, if you read the transcripts of phone conversations with Arab leaders, which are available at his library, my hilarious, best one is the one with Mubarak, where he says, "Why is Gaddafi saying mad things?" And Mubarak's thing is censored. I want the uncensored version now. Anyway, but they thought they were going to be greeted for helping liberate Kuwait. But actually, Bin Laden and others were furious. Why are foreign troops in the Holy Land? Who would have thought? So it's hard to go directly. That's one. Secondly, the biggest fear I have now is for Libya, not for blowback anywhere else. In Libya, the politics, this highly militarized situation, where there are guns everywhere, they're going to have a serious political debate about the future of Libya, where everybody's armed. This is not the best way, my friends, to have a political conversation. I mean, we are in an armed society. I'm scared to, rebuke somebody if they cut in front of me. They might take out some concealed weapon and shoot me in the kidney, you know. The highly militarized society, I fear now in the short run, the fear is Libya. Now, blowback in France, I mean, the French are crazy. They've just done this and they banned prayer in public. Yeah. Just now. They're crazy. You would have thought, Sarkozy, you just cleaned up your image. Election is coming. You and that Tintin character of yours, Bernard Henry Levy, showed up in Tripoli, right? With his shirt open till here, his hair blown, right? Walking the streets of Tripoli, BHL. Okay, I'd have thought you go back to France, say, I am the savior of Muslims. Cut the Muslim vote in France in half. But no, he comes back and banned public prayer. France doesn't need a blowback from Libya. The blowback is inside France. You treat people like shit like this, they're going to get mad. The English just faced that. Then Cameron said, oh, it's all criminals. It's not criminals. The more, I wrote a piece, it'll come in Left Business Observer. I am looking every day at the I-91 corridor, which used to be the Connecticut River. You know, from, well, not quite New Haven, but you get the picture. Hartford, Springfield, up the river. This corridor is going to erupt in riot within the next 10 years. The level of joblessness and police brutality is so intense, and violence. These cities are going to be burning soon. So London, Paris, when the Banyuels came into from the Banyuels, people came into the city, right? The rioting in France, what, 3-4 years ago? We don't need blowback. It's coming inside. What happens now in Libya? All eyes on Libya.
Yes, in the back.
In relation
What's your name, by the way?
Somaya.
It's okay. In relation to the role of the military, you were saying earlier that there is a theory that along with the decline of empires, you see the rise of increased military warfare on a broad scale, on a large scale. But I'm wondering if you could comment on the role of the rise of counterinsurgency doctrine in relation to the war at home. So particularly the idea that the war America is fighting is not against a marked enemy per se, but against an urban group of people who are disguised within the population, so that heightened surveillance, etc., and whether you see that as related to the decline of the American empire and a desperate attempt to hold on to power, or the rise of something new, which is to say a new form of warfare that is not at home.
This kind of stuff I don't like to think about, Somaya, because then I fear my people I see on the street or people who come to meetings or who here is the FBI agent filling some file somewhere. There's a fear of these things. It's a relevant fear. But also I try my best to block it out personally. Anyway, there was if you may have read Christian Parenti's new book, Tropic of Chaos, he opens with an exercise that the military was doing in Oakland, counterinsurgency in urban areas. They did a practice run in Oakland. And that was linked to the theory the military has that with climate change there'll be resource fights and how to control mass population unrest, etc. I mean, look, all of us have been at one point to one of these protests, IMF protests, WTO protests, G7 protests, Pittsburgh last time, my God, it was scary. The Pittsburgh police, to me, I thought I was in like a Star Wars game. They were like stormtroopers with the shields, tuck, 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 marching in formation. I don't know if you have seen that. These are police forces. These are not military. These are not some special forces detachment. The regular police look to me like some, Star Wars, literally, those with the things marching up. Very scary. So the public space is where is dissent possible? That's why we have to be creative in our thinking. How to organize and form spaces of public hope that are not always going to be crushed by this. I remember that there was a guy from some political party with a foghorn going and yelling at the police as they were marching up. That was even more scary because they were getting angry. And when you see a beehive, you don't go and throw rocks at it. You have to calm it down. I'm not keen on, going and irritating police officers, getting smashed. I don't see the point in it, but apparently some people do. But so that was happening there. It's already thoroughly militarized. Protest, anti-protest things. Obviously, since 2001, our spaces are under surveillance, that stuff is there. And I know I'm reading a book by Laleh Khalili about counterinsurgency doctrine and torture and the crushing of public space. I mean, she demonstrates how the link goes back to the campaigns, wars against the Native Americans. You know, even like so, reservations, policing, surveillance, all that stuff. This has been an old game of power. But again, I would say the reason, I wasn't being flippant when I said I don't like to think about it. The reason I'm saying that is we should not allow the reality of that to be scary. Because the more of that they try, the less hegemony they have. That is, the less consent they have from the population. You know, that is a sign of weakness. That is not a sign of strength. The more they try to come after us, the more they send police at demonstrations, the more scared they are of us making our message clear. So I would say that that is a reality, and we have to study and acknowledge that reality, the internal suppression of dissent. But we should come at it with, you know, in a sense, a kind of existential aggression. Not that guy yelling in a bullhorn. But it should not, we should not think of it in a scary way. Earlier today as well, when she was talking in that way, I don't like that talk. Because that talk is a kind of, it's a kind of mutual paralysis. We all get scared.
Thanks, Vijay. I wonder if you could comment.
I had such great fellowship with liberals. You know, I mean, it was unbelievable, the kind of ease with which you could slip into a conversation with a liberal and so much to agree with. You know, it's a time I look back fondly. So there was something important and impressive in the fact that it punctured something. It allowed a critique of warfare to be normalized. Even though it was, as Obama very rightly put it, for that liberal tendency, the bad war. And then there was the good war. And Bush should not have prosecuted the bad war. And Obama was never a progressive. He was always a liberal. That the bad war was Iraq. And he spoke very eloquently against the bad war. But he always defended the good war, which was Afghanistan. So, in a sense, it was good to have some space, public mass space, to talk about militarism. You know, I mean, I work with the National Priorities Project, and the hits spiked in the Bush years. People were interested in military spending, you know, topics that were bizarre. Now, the problem, of course, was Obama's victory. Because the victory of Obama, however good that was for, you know, making 10% of hardcore white racists vomit every night, which is a huge, like, victory. You know, every time they see him on television, they're gagging. Okay? That's the only reason I'm happy he's president. He gives indigestion to the racists, you know. That's it. But there was no way, no possibility for him to carry forward the energy of the Bush years. So all our alliances died out. And that, I think it's provided us an interesting moment. And I'll come at this in two ways. One is I was very happy to see the formation of the United National Anti-War Committee, the UNAC. Why? Because UNAC, unlike the kind of liberal left formations of the 2000s, actually took Islamophobia seriously. It's the first formation that has articulated imperialism and Islamophobia together. Which is why at the April 9th march, there were so many mosques on the street. The 100 Imams for Peace called out the mosques. And about 1/3 of the people on the street had come from the mosques, largely Bangladeshi mosques. You know, that was the mass support. Then there were the left-wing organizations, then there were the peace organizations. You know, Bethlehem Peace Committee, Quakers for the... But that 1/3 Muslim population that came from the had not been to any march that I had been to previously. Not even February 15th. That was a real novelty for me, to see the mosque come on. So that's one good development. That this linking of Islamophobia and war has been made, at least in this quarter. Second thing is, I think we as a movement have to do one thing which people are doing, is to link our localities, the local costs of war. And of course, it was useful in the last 10 years to have these war dollars resolutions in city councils. Why? Because it forced the mayors, the Conference of US Mayors, this last summer, to pass a resolution against military spending. which is the highest mainstream body to pass a resolution against military spending. And we on the left have not used that as a standard and propagandized with it, that the US Conference of Mayors has taken a position against a military budget. That's a big deal. And Villaraigosa of LA was the head of the Conference of Mayors, and he's no progressive. But he was forced to stand up there and defend this thing. I mean, he's a big military funding guy. It's LA after all.